20 years after her mother vanished, a child whispered, "She's in the well." What they found broke this town open. The wind in Ridgefield carried memories. It swept down the narrow lane behind the Lane house, curled around the old hydrangeas, and rustled the half-dead oak that loomed beside the sealed well. That well had been there long before Beckett Lane arrived. He was 4 when Eleanor and Gregory brought him home from the county shelter. Small, soft-spoken, with hair too light for either of them, and eyes that studied the world like he'd seen it all before. He didn't cry much, but he talked in his sleep. The first time Eleanor heard it, she was folding towels in the hallway. "Mama's in the well," Beckett murmured behind the door. "She's cold. She said it's dark down there." She paused, towel in hand, and something old and unsettled stirred in her chest. Gregory didn't pause when she told him. "He's making it up," he said, brushing breadcrumbs from his plate. "You coddle that boy too much." "He's 4, Greg. That doesn't sound like make-believe." "He needs to learn silence," Gregory snapped. "You think I got where I am by entertaining ghosts?" That was Gregory Lane. Polished shoes, straight ties, and answers carved in stone. The type of man who took pride in quiet dinners and obedience. But Beckett saw things. At night, he sat by the window, watching the wind pull at the grass near the well. He'd press his forehead against the glass like he was listening. Once, Eleanor found a crayon sketch tucked in the couch. A woman in a green-blue dress, arms reaching up from inside a circle of stone. No mouth. Just eyes, wide and pleading. When she showed it to Gregory, he scoffed. "Let it go, Eleanor. That woman left her life years ago. We gave that boy a name and a roof. That's all he needs." But he didn't look her in the eyes when he said it. He rarely did when it came to the past. Beckett kept whispering, in sleep, in play, in silence, and the well kept waiting. It was nearly Christmas when it happened. Ridgefield's air had that frost-heavy stillness, the kind that made every breath feel borrowed. Eleanor was in the kitchen, her hands deep in bread dough, when she heard the screen door creak. She found Beckett in the backyard, barefoot in the cold, standing beside the well. His hand was on the concrete lid, eyes closed. "She sang to me last night," he said. "She said not to be afraid anymore." Eleanor's throat tightened. "Who? Baby?" He turned to her, voice soft but certain. "My real mama. Her name is Rosemary. She had hair like yours, but she smelled like flowers." Gregory was furious. He pulled Beckett inside, washed his feet too roughly, and barked for him to stop the nonsense. "You ungrateful little thing," he muttered. "We saved you." But Beckett didn't cry. He looked up at Gregory with those quiet old eyes and whispered, "You know where she is." Gregory slapped him, just once. And something in Eleanor's chest cracked, not loudly, not enough for the neighbors to hear, but enough to make her begin to listen differently. Weeks passed. Beckett grew quieter, but he kept drawing. Always the well, always the woman. Then came the night Eleanor found him curled beneath the kitchen table, clutching one of her scarves to his nose. It smelled faintly of lavender. He didn't look at her when she knelt beside him. "She's cold, Mama, and she waits for me every night. She says, I'm brave, even when I'm scared." "Who says that, baby?" "Rosemary, but you can call her Rosie." He held up a drawing. This time, the woman was smiling. Still no mouth, but the eyes were peaceful. And that was when Eleanor cried. She didn't sleep that night. Instead, she sat at the kitchen table, staring at the locked drawer in Gregory's study. The one with the false bottom. The one he told her never to touch. She waited until he left for work, took the key from his cufflink drawer, and opened it. Inside, an old photograph of a woman she'd never seen before. Green-blue dress, hair swept to one side, standing beside Gregory, pregnant. Her name was written on the back, in slanted, careful cursive. Rosemary Quinn. Summer, 1999. The same year Beckett was born. The photograph shook in Eleanor's hands. She looked toward the backyard, where the well stood silent under a thin veil of frost. At dinner that evening, she asked carefully, "Did you know a woman named Rosemary Quinn?" Gregory's fork paused mid-air. Just for a second. Number Y. Beckett mentioned the name, said she used to sing to him. Gregory didn't blink. He didn't breathe. Then, cold as polished stone, "Don't bring that name into this house again." Eleanor tucked Beckett in that night with gentler hands. She kissed his forehead and whispered, "Tell me what else," she said, "sweetheart." He smiled sleepily. She said, "It's almost time. The truth will come up, just like flowers do." And outside, the wind stirred the leaves, and the well waited. Quiet, but not silent. The Lane house wasn't large. It stood at the edge of Ridgefield, like a thought someone had once meant to finish. White siding, weathered grey by time, shutters that hadn't closed in years, and a front porch that creaked even when no one was walking on it. Inside, it smelled of lemon polish and old secrets. Eleanor kept it that way, neat, quiet, predictable. She ironed Gregory's shirts every Sunday evening and rotated the cushions every Wednesday. She watered the plants with 2 measured cups each. Order was her shelter. It had to be. Gregory Lane was the kind of man who believed love should not disrupt the silence of a room. He was a bank manager, always crisp in his collars and sharper in his opinions. His presence filled a space in the way smoke might, invisibly stifling. "Emotions are indulgences," he once told Eleanor on their wedding night, "and indulgence is a form of weakness." It wasn't cruelty, not in the way people understood it. It was discipline, he claimed, strength, decency. But decency, Eleanor had learned, could be used like a weapon if you held it close enough to someone's throat. They'd adopted Beckett after 4 miscarriages and the slow dissolving of their last hope. It wasn't her idea. Eleanor had learned to stop having ideas by then. Gregory wanted a legacy, not a child, someone to mold, not hold. A boy, not a baby, he had told the agency, old enough to walk and know his place. Beckett had been just shy of 4 when he arrived, quiet, wide-eyed, fragile in the way old souls sometimes are. He didn't cry when Eleanor first bathed him, just looked at the steam curling off the water, like he'd seen something rise and vanish before. That night, he asked where the well was. "The one in the back," he said. "The one with the stone lid. That's where my other mama sings sometimes." Eleanor had paused, her fingers tightening around the spoon she stirred sugar into his milk with. She hadn't shown him the backyard yet. Beckett had been in the house a month when he stopped eating for 3 days. When Gregory demanded an explanation, Beckett said, in a voice like falling leaves, "I can't eat while Mama Rosie's still cold." Gregory's face froze, just for a moment. Then he stood, wiped his hands with surgical calm, and leaned over the boy. "There is no Rosie. You live in this house now. You will not embarrass us with nonsense." "But she didn't want to leave," Beckett whispered. "You pushed her. I saw it in the water." Eleanor never forgot the sound of Gregory's hand striking the table, not because it was loud, because it was practiced, like something that had happened before. That night, she sat alone in the laundry room, staring at a load of whites she'd forgotten to start. Her fingers trembled against the dial. There were 3 bedrooms in the house. Gregory took the largest. Eleanor's room was smaller, filled with old books and a single rocking chair she rarely used anymore. Beckett's room was at the end of the hallway, always slightly ajar. Sometimes, at night, Eleanor would sit outside his door just to hear him breathe. She used to hum, Beckett said once, eyes half closed. A soft tune. It sounded like wind in the tall grass. "Do you miss her?" Eleanor had asked. He nodded. Then, with a kind of gentle clarity most adults never reach, he added, "Missing someone doesn't mean you hate the person who came after." In Ridgefield, people didn't ask questions unless they already knew the answers. Eleanor had learned that too, but rumors moved like ivy, silent, stubborn, slow to die. They said Gregory once had a secretary who disappeared. They said she'd been pregnant. They said she was trouble. Gregory called it gossip. But he had burned the old family photo albums. And once, when Eleanor asked about a worn brass locket in his drawer, he said flatly, "That belonged to someone who didn't know when to stop talking." Eleanor didn't ask again. The backyard had grown wild around the sealed well. Eleanor used to tend it, but Gregory had told her to let it go. "Nothing good grows near graves," he said. It was the closest he ever came to confessing anything. Beckett rarely smiled, but he laughed once, when a robin landed on the kitchen window just long enough to peck the glass. "She used to feed birds," he whispered. "She said their wings carry prayers faster." Eleanor bit the inside of her cheek until it bled. On Sunday afternoons, the three of them would sit in the living room, Gregory reading his paper, Eleanor crocheting something she'd never finish, Beckett drawing. Always the same thing, a circle of stones, a woman beneath it, arms raised. Not in fear, but in hope. One day, he colored the sky above her a pale blue, a sun breaking through grey. "She says she's almost free," he whispered. And for the first time in years, Eleanor dropped a stitch and let it stay dropped. Beckett began drawing women without mouths. At first, Eleanor thought it was a phase. Children had strange imaginations. But the figures kept showing up, always the same. A woman in a green-blue dress, standing in the rain, or reaching upward from beneath something round and dark. He didn't name her, but he always shaded the background grey. One morning, while folding his laundry, Eleanor found a drawing crumpled under his bed. It was different. The same woman, but this time her eyes were closed. There was a necklace around her neck, a tiny heart locket, drawn with the kind of care only memory gives. She sat on his bed for a long time, the drawing in her lap, her hands not moving. The light coming through the blinds fell in soft stripes across the floor, and for a brief moment, she felt as though the house had stopped breathing. At school, Beckett's teachers sent notes home. He wouldn't speak in class. He wouldn't eat lunch unless he had a napkin folded just so, like a cloth tucked under fine china. "He's a delicate child," one teacher wrote. "He sees things in patterns, repeats words softly under his breath. Sometimes they sound like names." One day, Eleanor picked him up early and asked gently, "Who's Rosemary, sweetheart?" Beckett didn't answer at first. He just looked at the bare trees lining the sidewalk outside the car window. Then, in a voice so quiet it felt borrowed, he whispered, "She used to hold my hands while we danced. In the kitchen, she called it the butterfly waltz." Eleanor's hands gripped the steering wheel tighter. And who is she now? A secret that doesn't want to be secret anymore. That night, she didn't speak to Gregory during dinner. He noticed. Of course he did. He always noticed everything. "The boy's been drawing those nonsense women again," he said. His fork scraped the plate. "Maybe you should take him to someone. Get him fixed before he starts believing it himself." "Maybe he already does," she replied, voice low. "You're starting to sound like him. You want to end up on pills, Eleanor, like your sister." She stared at her plate. Mashed potatoes gone cold, peas untouched. Her wedding ring felt heavier than usual. Later that week, she found Beckett outside the back door in his socks, staring at the well. The wind tugged at his shirt. His fingers curled and uncurled, like they were remembering how to hold something precious. "She used to sing to me," he murmured, "but now she just hums, like she's trying not to cry." Eleanor knelt beside him. "Why was she crying, sweetheart?" He looked at her, not like a child looks at a mother, but like someone who's been waiting to be believed. Because someone shut the lid before she was done saying goodbye. Gregory had locked the lid on that well himself years ago, said it was dangerous, unstable. Eleanor remembered the cement drying in the sun, the sharpness in his eyes when she asked what he'd done with the old bucket and rope. "Buried," he said flatly. "Same place we bury foolish questions?" Beckett began waking in the middle of the night. Eleanor would find him curled at the base of the bedroom door or sitting silently in the hallway, his eyes too awake for the hour. "She's calling me," he said one night, his voice dry with sleep, but not with words. It's like when the air shifts before a storm. At the library, Eleanor began looking through old town records, quietly, carefully. Gregory didn't know. She used her maiden name to check them out. One file caught her eye. Rosemary Quinn, former Ridgefield resident, domestic worker. Age, 27. Last seen, May, 1999. Beckett had been born that same summer, and Gregory had taken a sudden 2-week business retreat in June of that year. The record said she'd left town, but no one had seen her leave. No forwarding address, no bank activity. Just gone, like dust brushed from a shelf. At supper, Gregory asked where she'd been that afternoon. His tone was smooth, almost polite. "You're wearing lipstick," he noted. "Funny time to start caring about your face again." Eleanor looked him square in the eye. Something in her spine had gone still. "I was at the library." "What for?" "Looking for a ghost." A beat of silence. Then his fork fell loudly onto the plate. "We don't entertain ghosts in this house." "No," she said. "We marry them." That night, she sat beside Beckett's bed, long after he'd fallen asleep. His breathing was steady, but his fingers twitched now and then, as if brushing through dreams. She picked up the drawing on his nightstand. The woman again. But this time, there was something new. A crack in the circle of stones above her, and just beyond it, a single bird in flight. She stared at it until her eyes blurred. Then she whispered, "I hear her too." And somewhere outside, the wind shifted again. Just slightly, as if it had been waiting to be invited in. The library in Ridgefield was the kind of place where time seemed to slow out of respect. Dust settled gently on the windowsills, and the light that filtered through the high windows had the soft amber hue of old parchment and better days. Beckett liked it there. He came every Thursday afternoon right after school, slipped between the rows of books like a shadow that didn't want to be noticed. He never checked anything out. He didn't need to. He remembered everything he read. That Thursday, he sat on the far side of the children's section, cross-legged, leafing through a book about memory. His fingertips traced the words like they were braille for the heart. Memory is not just what we recall. It is what refuses to be forgotten. Across the room, a man sat at the corner table. Quiet, older, dressed in a tweed jacket with a faded scarf, loosely knotted at the throat. His cane leaned against the chair, but his posture didn't ask for pity. Harold Whitmore. No one called him Mr. Whitmore anymore. He hadn't used his fortune in over a decade, not since his daughter died, and his world folded in on itself like a burned letter. He lived alone on the north edge of town, in the stone house with the wind chimes no one else could hear. That day, Harold watched Beckett for a long time, not with suspicion, not with curiosity, with recognition. There was something in the way the boy sat, shoulders just slightly hunched, eyes too still for someone his age. Harold had seen that look before, in mirrors and in graves. When Beckett closed the book and rose to put it back, Harold spoke, softly, like one does when addressing a deer near the tree line. "You read like someone looking for someone." Beckett turned, startled, clutching the book to his chest. "I'm not stealing it," he said quickly. Harold smiled, slow and sad. "I know. You're remembering something no one told you." Beckett blinked, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't answer with silence. "She hums at night, in my dreams, and sometimes in the wind." "Your mother?" A pause, then a nod. "She wears green and smells like flowers. I think it's lavender, but nobody believes me." Harold didn't speak. He just reached for the book Beckett held and opened to the page the boy had marked with the fold of his palm. The truth may bury itself in silence, but it always leaves behind a song. He closed the book gently. "Come back tomorrow," Harold said. "Same time, I'll be here." They met again, and again. Thursdays turned into Mondays. The library became their church. Words, their prayers. Harold never asked too much. He let Beckett offer what he could, when he could. They talked about books, about music, about birds and dreams, and how the trees seem to whisper if you sit still long enough. And then, one grey afternoon, as the first flakes of February drifted down outside, Beckett whispered, "Do you believe some people die, but don't go away?" Harold took a breath so slow it hurt. "Yes," he said, "some people don't leave because they weren't finished being loved." Beckett's eyes welled. He looked down at his shoes. "She didn't mean to go. I think someone made her." Harold felt it then, the shift, the tremor beneath the words. Not fantasy, not a game, a fracture in something that had long tried to stay whole. "Tell me what you remember." Beckett reached into his backpack and pulled out a crumpled drawing. The same woman, the green-blue dress, arms reaching up from below stones. "She never screams in my dreams," he said. "She just waits." That night, Harold returned to his home and opened a drawer he hadn't touched in 6 years. Inside, a letter, still sealed. His daughter's last, found after the accident. He hadn't been able to read it, but now he did. "Daddy, there are kids out there who don't get saved because nobody listens to them. Be someone who listens." He held the paper like it might dissolve, and for the first time in many winters, Harold cried. Not from grief, but from a strange, fierce hope. The next morning, Harold met Eleanor Lane. He didn't introduce himself as anyone important, just a neighbor, a man concerned about the boy who came to the library alone. "He's drawn to silence," Harold said. "That usually means he's surviving something loud." Eleanor's face tightened. "He tells stories that don't make sense, or truths that haven't been given permission yet." She didn't answer, just stared out the window. "He says his mother is in a well," Harold added quietly. "That she didn't want to leave, that she's still waiting." Eleanor turned then. Her voice was brittle. "That well is sealed. And that story, whatever it is, should stay buried." Harold nodded respectfully. "But what if it's not a story?" he asked. "What if it's a prayer?" There was no answer, just the sound of wind against the glass. But in Beckett's room that night, Eleanor found a new drawing. The same woman. But this time, there was light coming from above, and on the back, in Beckett's small, neat handwriting, "He believes me." The first time Harold looked into Gregory Lane's history, he wasn't expecting much. A name like that didn't ring bells. It folded into spreadsheets: bank manager, civic donor, churchgoer, a face always at the edges of town parades, never in the spotlight. The kind of man who left no trace, not because he had nothing to hide, but because he knew exactly how to clean up. But Harold had known men like him before, the ones who didn't raise their voices because they never needed to. What troubled Harold wasn't what he found, it was what he didn't. There were gaps, missing files, loose threads no one had bothered to pull. So he pulled. He started with Beckett's adoption papers. It should have been simple, an open and shut county file, processed cleanly like any other state placement. But the date on the final document had been overwritten. Subtly. Just enough to be noticed if you had once been the kind of man who read contracts worth millions. Harold wasn't just a man of means. He had been a man of law. A litigator before grief cracked him into someone softer. Now that skill stirred back to life, not for a client, not for money, but for a boy who spoke in ghosts and colored memory in pencil. He brought the documents to someone he trusted. Mason Reed. 35, sharp, honest, public records clerk for the Ridgefield town office and Gregory Lane's own nephew. Mason had grown up under Gregory's quiet rule. He remembered the way his uncle spoke with a voice that felt like a locked door. But Mason wasn't a child anymore. And when Harold handed him the file, he read it with a frown that grew deeper with every page. This birth certificate, it doesn't match the standard template from that year, Mason said. And the social worker signature? It's the name of someone who retired in '98. Beckett was placed in 2000, Harold replied. And the original record of maternal surrender? Gone, Mason whispered. Scrubbed. Later that evening, Mason sat in his office long after hours, lit only by the low green lamp at his desk. He typed in a name he hadn't thought of in nearly 2 decades. Rosemary Quinn. The search turned up almost nothing. No tax records past '99, no job transfers, no death certificate. Just a residential file listing her as a live-in domestic assistant at Gregory and Eleanor Lane's home in early 1999. Terminated in May. Terminated. Not resigned. Mason exhaled. The word chilled. The file hadn't been updated, hadn't even been officially closed. It had just stopped. He printed the record and placed it in a manila folder. On the tab, he wrote in black ink, "Missing Rosemary Quinn." Then he locked the drawer, knowing it wouldn't stay closed for long. The next morning, Harold waited by the back gate of the Lane house. Eleanor came out in her gardening coat, a trowel in one hand and her late mother's rosary beads around her wrist. They hadn't spoken since their last meeting, but something in her eyes had changed. It wasn't resistance anymore. It was mourning. For what? She wasn't sure. "He knows things he shouldn't," she whispered. "Smells, sounds, her name. I never told him any of it." Harold handed her the folder. She didn't open it right away, just stared at the weight of it in her hands. "You need to see this," he said. "Not because it will fix anything, but because it may explain why your house has been so silent all these years." Inside, among the records, was a photo Mason had found in an old employee file. Rosemary stood in a kitchen, smiling, her hand gently resting on a baby bump. A breeze had caught her hair. Behind her, barely visible through a window pane, stood a man, face in shadow. But Eleanor didn't need light to recognize Gregory's posture. Her knees gave slightly. She sat on the porch steps without a word. That night, she didn't eat, didn't speak to Gregory. She watched him as he sat with his paper, humming a tune he claimed not to remember learning. The kind of tune a woman might hum in the kitchen while dancing with a child. A butterfly waltz. "Did you know she was pregnant?" Eleanor asked, not looking up. The newspaper rustled. Gregory didn't answer right away. "Some women lie," he said at last. "It's a survival tactic, like makeup." "She trusted us," Eleanor said, voice trembling. "She came to our home, carried your child, cared for ours, and then vanished." Gregory turned a page with deliberate calm. "The world doesn't need every story told, Eleanor. But Beckett's does." He looked at her then, something cold behind his eyes. That boy is ours because no one wanted him. That's what matters. She wanted him. A pause. A long one. Then, well, she doesn't anymore. In the dark, Eleanor found herself in the laundry room again. Same spot she'd stood years ago when Beckett first came home. Only this time, she didn't fold. She opened the bottom drawer of the old dresser Gregory kept locked. And there, beneath spare ties and cufflinks, was a small brass locket. She opened it. Inside, a faded photo of a newborn, and a scrap of ribbon, lavender-scented, though the scent had almost gone. She placed it on Beckett's pillow that night. No explanation, no questions, just the locket, and her presence beside him as he slept. In the morning, he didn't ask where it came from. He just held it in his palm and said, "She wore this when she tucked me in." Eleanor sat on the edge of his bed, brushing the hair from his brow. "I'm sorry I didn't believe you sooner." Beckett looked up, solemn, but soft. "It's okay. Some people have to forget before they can remember." Outside, the frost had begun to lift. The well sat quiet in the backyard, surrounded by the first signs of thaw. Not a sound came from it, but if you stood close enough, you could hear something almost like breath, or maybe memory. The permit came through on a Tuesday. It arrived in a plain envelope, hand-delivered by a quiet young deputy who kept his eyes down as he passed it to Eleanor. His hands trembled slightly, as if the weight of the envelope carried more than paper. As if it carried breath, held too long in the chest of a house that had forgotten how to exhale. Inside was a single sheet, stamped, signed, approved, authorization to unseal the well behind 218 Orchard Lane. Eleanor stared at it without blinking. She didn't say, "Thank you." She didn't say anything at all. The day of the dig, the town felt like it was holding its breath. News had spread, as it always did in places like Ridgefield. The well behind the Lane house, the one children had once dared each other to touch, the one Eleanor had planted lilacs around for years, was about to be opened. Some came out of curiosity. Some came out of guilt. A few came because they remembered the girl with the lavender ribbon who disappeared one spring and was never spoken of again. Harold stood at the edge of the yard, coat collar turned against the wind. Beckett stood beside him, holding the brass locket in one hand, his fingers curled around it like prayer beads. He was quiet, his eyes fixed on the stone lid. He was 24 now, but looked younger in the morning light, softer, like a page returning to the blank. The crew arrived just before noon. They didn't ask questions, just measured the perimeter, laid out tarps, and moved with the mechanical rhythm of men trained to open the earth without letting it speak too loudly. The first crack of stone echoed like a shot. Beckett flinched. Eleanor reached for his arm but stopped short. He didn't turn. He didn't blink. Just stood, eyes unblinking, breath shallow as the cement lid was lifted. Underneath, dark soil, dry, undisturbed, until the first shovel hit something soft. They worked slowly, respectfully, one layer at a time. Then the smell came, not strong, not rancid, but unmistakable. The scent of time caught in cloth, and something blue, fabric, torn at the edge, soiled but still clinging to color, a green-blue dress. The digging stopped. A detective stepped in. They brought a tent, set up screens. The crowd murmured, but no one moved closer. The sun was slipping behind the maples, casting long shadows that touched the porch steps, like fingers reaching for truth. And then the medical examiner gave a quiet nod. They found her, curled inward, arms folded around something small. A photo, water-damaged, but visible. A baby, a boy. Beckett stared at it for a long time, then whispered, "She never let go." Gregory arrived just as they began the forensic process. He stood at the edge of the crowd, his face pale but unreadable. His suit was pressed, his tie navy blue. He looked like a man arriving for a meeting, not a reckoning. Eleanor turned to face him. "You buried her," she said, voice quiet but hard. Gregory didn't deny it. He didn't flinch. "She threatened to ruin everything," he said, as if the explanation mattered. "I gave her a place, a roof. She wasn't supposed to become difficult." Harold stepped forward. "She was carrying your child." Gregory looked at Beckett, his lip twitching slightly. "She made choices. I made mine." "You made a grave," Beckett said, eyes level, "and called it order." Gregory's jaw clenched. "I made peace. You people just refused to let it rest." It rained that night. Not heavily, just enough to soften the ground, to baptize the truth as it rose. Eleanor sat at the kitchen table, the locket on the wood between her hands. Across from her, Beckett stared out the window. "Do you remember her?" she asked. Beckett nodded. "Not with my mind, with my bones. She used to hum when she rocked me. It's the same rhythm as the trees when the wind comes slow." "She was kind," Eleanor said, tears gathering but not falling. "I watched her once, twirling you in the living room when Gregory wasn't home. I should have seen." "You did," he said gently. "Just not soon enough." She reached for his hand, and this time he let her take it. 2 days later, the coroner released the final report. Cause of death: blunt force trauma to the back of the skull. Estimated time of death: late May, 1999. The infant she carried had not yet been born. DNA confirmed the remains as Rosemary Quinn, and Beckett as her son. At the memorial, there were no speeches, just wind and lavender and silence. They buried her properly this time, with a name, with her locket, and with the photo, dried now, framed in glass, placed gently in the casket by Beckett himself. "She waited 20 years, he said softly, standing at the edge of the grave. "And I'm sorry it took me that long to come back for her." Eleanor placed a single sprig of rosemary atop the coffin. "She deserved better." "She'll have it now," Beckett said. "I'll make sure of it." The town didn't talk much afterward. Ridgefield had always been better at forgetting than forgiving, but someone left a small card at the grave weeks later, handwritten in tidy script. "I remember her laughter at the bakery. I wish I'd said something when she stopped coming." A neighbor. At home, Beckett sat alone at the well, now filled with fresh soil and ringed in white stones. Harold joined him, slow in step, but steady. "Truth hurts," he said, "but silence wounds deeper." Beckett nodded. She never raised her voice, but her silence, it kept calling. Harold smiled, eyes misty. She raised a son who listened. That night, Eleanor lit a candle in the kitchen window, not because anyone needed the light, but because someone, once, had been left in the dark. The courthouse in Ridgefield wasn't grand. It didn't need to be. It was a white brick building with a bell that hadn't rung since 1982, windows that rattled when the wind moved just right, and pew-like benches worn smooth by years of quiet watching. But on the day the state of Connecticut versus Gregory Lane began, every creak and breath seemed sharpened. People came early, dressed in wool coats and careful silence. Most came not to see justice unfold, but to feel, for once, that silence might finally answer back. Eleanor sat in the second row, a soft scarf around her neck, hands folded in her lap, like prayer. Beside her, Harold Whitmore. On her other side, Beckett, taller now, older in posture, but still holding the small brass locket in his fist. Gregory entered flanked by 2 attorneys, spine stiff, eyes steady. He wore the same expression he had on the morning after Rosemary vanished, blank but rehearsed, as if decency were a mask you could pin to your face if you stood still long enough. The charges: second-degree murder, obstruction of justice, tampering with public records, and beneath them all, betrayal. He pled not guilty. Of course he did. The prosecutor, a woman named Maureen Hale, firm-voiced and sharp-eyed, began with the photo. Rosemary Quinn, 27, radiant, smiling into a spring morning, 5 months pregnant. Hired help, yes, but no less human. Then the ledger pages, missing entries, forged medical records, a resignation letter typed in a font that didn't exist until 3 years after it was supposedly written. This wasn't a clerical error, Maureen said, pacing slowly. It was an erasure. The word hung in the room like smoke. The defense tried to cast Gregory as a man of measured habits, a private man, a generous community figure. There is no evidence, his lawyer insisted, of direct harm, no witnesses, no motive, just coincidence, suspicion, and a tragic end we cannot explain. Beckett leaned forward slightly, eyes locked on the man who raised him, but never once bent to love him. Eleanor's hands trembled. She reached for the rosary beads tucked into her coat pocket. Then came the testimony. Mason Reed took the stand first. His voice shook, but he spoke clearly. The altered files, the time-stamped erasures, the chain of custody that traced directly back to Gregory's office. Then a neighbor, an older woman named Florence, testified that she remembered hearing an argument that May, screaming. A slammed door. A woman crying. I didn't say anything back then, she admitted. He was respected. And she was just the help. The courtroom held its breath. But I always wondered why she left her garden tools behind. She'd just planted iris bulbs the week before. Next was Harold. He walked slowly to the stand, his cane tapping softly, like punctuation. He spoke of the drawings, the boy who remembered things no one told him, the locket, the humming, the ache of truth trying to rise through silence. I believe children know things, Harold said, voice hoarse with feeling. They know when someone is missing, not because someone told them, but because a part of their story never arrived. Then, finally, Beckett. The courtroom went still. Even Gregory looked up. For the first time in the trial, his eyes didn't wander. Beckett sat straight, not defiant, not broken, just steady. I was 4 when I came to live with the Lanes. I don't remember my first bed or what my mother smelled like, but I remember music, a hum, a woman's voice telling me I was brave. I remember a stone circle and arms reaching. I remember knowing, deep in my stomach, that someone had been waiting a long, long time. Maureen nodded. And when you saw the remains? I didn't need proof. I just needed someone to stop pretending she never existed. Then he turned, slowly, to look at Gregory. You could have told the truth. You could have said her name, just once. But you buried her. And then you tried to bury me. A hush followed. The kind that isn't empty, but filled with grief. Gregory's attorney didn't cross-examine. There was nothing left to scrape clean. The final day of trial brought Eleanor to the stand. She wore grey, no makeup, a simple pin on her coat, rosemary and forget-me-not. Her voice when it came was soft, but deliberate. He told me she left, that she was unstable, that she wasn't suited for motherhood. I believed him, because I needed to believe we were saving someone. She paused, eyes shimmering. But we weren't saving anyone. We were stealing what was never ours to keep. I didn't kill her, but I did nothing while she died. And that's something I'll carry until the Lord decides I've remembered her long enough. No one moved. But I remember her now, and I say her name every morning. Rosemary Quinn. Forgive me. The jury was out for 2 days. When they returned, the verdict was unanimous. Guilty. On all counts. Gregory showed no reaction, just stared straight ahead, as if waiting for the air to move. He was sentenced to 25 years. Not because of his age, not because of remorse, but because some silences echo loudest when heard by a jury of neighbors. Outside the courthouse, the winter light broke through clouds. It wasn't bright, but it was enough. Reporters asked Beckett for a statement. He simply held up the locket and said, "Some justice takes time. Some love never leaves." Then he walked down the steps beside Eleanor, her arm gently threaded through his. Back home, he found a letter waiting on the porch. No name on the envelope. Just a single line on the note inside. "You gave her voice back. Thank you." He didn't need to know who wrote it. Some things are meant to be anonymous, so the truth can speak louder. That evening, they lit 3 candles on the windowsill. One for Rosemary, one for the child she never got to raise, and one for the life that finally said her name out loud. Winter left Ridgefield gently that year. It didn't slam the door or scatter its frost in defiance. It backed out slowly, like someone who'd overstayed their welcome, and finally knew it. The snow melted in soft sighs, revealing patches of grass and sidewalk chalk drawings left behind by children who didn't yet know what time takes. Beckett stood on the back porch of the Lane house, his house now, in all but deed, watching the ground where the well had once been. It had been filled not with concrete, but earth. Rich, clean soil brought in from a nursery 3 towns over. The old stones were left intact, not to cover, but to circle, like hands, like memory. A rosemary bush had been planted at the center. He hadn't wanted anything too grand. Just something that grew in silence, something you had to lean close to smell. She never wanted a monument, he'd told Eleanor. Just someone to say her name out loud once in a while. Eleanor had changed since the trial, not in the way people sometimes claim when they mean haircuts and posture, but truly changed. Her eyes no longer looked past things. They met them. She no longer kept the house polished within an inch of its breath. She let dust settle on the piano, let the kitchen faucet drip sometimes as though saying, "Life is still here. Let it speak." Most days, she spent her mornings in the garden, hands in dirt, knees in soft ache. She planted wildflowers in haphazard rows, letting color claim the lawn like it never had before. She also started keeping a journal. Not for her, for Rosemary. Each morning, she wrote a single line. Sometimes it was, "I heard a robin sing this morning," same note she used to hum. Other times, "I wish I'd stopped folding laundry that day. I wish I'd gone to her." She never signed them. She just folded the page, tucked it in the hollow of the rosemary bush, and let time carry the rest. Harold Whitmore became a more frequent presence, not out of duty, but rhythm. He was part of the home now, the same way creaking floorboards and the kettle's whistle were. One afternoon, he brought over a small wooden box. Inside, newspaper clippings, letters, and a faded photo of his daughter, Amelia. The last thing she had mailed before her death was a drawing by a foster girl she mentored, her name scribbled in purple crayon beneath it. Rosemary. Harold placed it gently on the mantel. "She saw something in that girl before anyone else did," he told Beckett, "and I think part of her's still whispering through you." Beckett started writing again. Not reports, not statements, but letters. He wrote to Rosemary, "You don't know this version of me, but I think you might have liked him. He listens now." Each letter began the same way. "Dear Mama." Each ended the same way. "I'll keep saying your name, I promise." The town shifted too, quietly, without announcement. The library added a children's reading nook named the Rosemary Room, lined with soft chairs and green-blue curtains. There was no plaque describing why. Just a photo of a young woman smiling, holding a book to her chest. Her eyes were tired, but open, like someone who knew they might not be remembered properly, but hoped. Mason Reed took on more than just public records. He volunteered at the youth shelter twice a week, teaching teens how to search public databases, how to find themselves when the world forgets to keep track. "Paper trails save lives," he said once, handing a boy his birth certificate for the first time. And sometimes they uncover ghosts who shouldn't have been hidden. One Sunday, Eleanor cooked pancakes, not because anyone asked, just because the morning felt like it needed something warm and imperfect. Beckett poured syrup slowly, his mind far off. "Do you think she forgave me?" he asked. Eleanor didn't answer right away. She poured tea, sat across from him. Her fingers brushed the edge of the table like a seamstress remembering thread. "Forgiveness isn't something we get in words," she said finally. "It's in what we do after the silence. I spent 20 years not knowing I had a mother. And now you've given her 20 more than most forgotten women ever get," she whispered. "You gave her back her name. You gave her back the wind." Beckett opened a small fund that spring. It wasn't large, but it was steady, the Rosemary Fund, to help women escape situations they hadn't yet found the words for, to help children find the people they'd been taught not to remember. Harold was the first donor. Eleanor donated her wedding ring. "Let it do some good, now that it finally knows what truth feels like," she said, as she dropped it into the velvet box. One letter came in May. No return address, just a typed line. "I used to work in the Ridgefield courthouse. I shredded files I was told to. I'm sorry. This is what I remember." Enclosed was a list. Names, dates. One of them matched Rosemary's employment record, misspelled, but there. Harold read the letter aloud at the kitchen table. Beckett folded it and placed it beside the locket in a small drawer. "It's not justice," he said, "but it's noise. And noise means someone else is waking up." Eleanor turned 70 that fall. She didn't want a party, but Beckett insisted on something small. They invited Harold, Mason, Florence, even the detective who opened the well. They ate outside, under strings of warm lights and paper lanterns made from pages of old cookbooks. Beckett handed Eleanor a journal, bound in soft green fabric. Inside, her own letters to Rosemary, transcribed, lined, and at the final page, a drawing. Beckett had done it. A woman in a green-blue dress, arms open, standing in a garden where rosemary and wildflowers grew side by side. Above her, a boy placing a hand on her shoulder. Later that night, Eleanor stood by the window, watching moths tap against the glass. "I used to think silence was noble," she said softly, "that keeping the peace meant not stirring ghosts. But ghosts don't stay buried because we close our mouths. They stay buried because no one sings their names." She turned to Beckett. "So let's keep singing, okay?" "Every morning," he said. In October, they planted daffodils along the path leading to the rosemary bush. Winter would come again. It always did. But now, when it did, there would be bulbs beneath the frost, ready to rise. And when they did, they'd rise with her name. In a town like Ridgefield, change doesn't come with fanfare. It arrives quietly, like steam curling from a teacup, delicate, nearly invisible, but warm to the touch. It takes root, not in laws or declarations, but in hearts, in choices, in the stillness before someone finally speaks the truth. By spring, the trial of Gregory Lane was no longer on television, but the echo of Rosemary Quinn's name had begun to drift across places it had never reached before. At Ridgefield High, a sophomore named Tasha Hayes sat in the back of her English class, drawing vines in the margins of her notebook. The news article about Rosemary had been stapled to a school bulletin board under a flyer about local history. Most students walked past it. Tasha stopped every morning to read it again. That morning, she didn't go to third period. Instead, she walked to the counselor's office and stood in the doorway, fists clenched inside her hoodie. Grace Holloway, the school counselor, looked up and smiled. 59, widowed, soft-spoken. The kind of woman who remembered birthdays and never judged broken fingernails. "You don't usually skip," she said gently. Tasha didn't sit down. She stared at the carpet, voice low. There was this woman, in a well. Her son found her, after 20 years. Grace nodded. She knew. "If I told you something, would you believe me?" Grace didn't move. She just reached across the desk, turned off the light and said, "You don't have to tell me everything. Just start where it hurts." That's all it took. A few streets over, Henry Cobb, the town florist, began tucking sprigs of rosemary into every bouquet. Weddings, funerals, anniversaries. "For remembrance," he said to each customer, "for stories that took too long to be heard." Some customers smiled, some teared up. Most didn't ask questions. But every once in a while, someone would pause and whisper, "She mattered, didn't she?" And Henry would answer, "Yes, she still does." At the diner near Main Street, Florence, now 84, baked again. The same woman who had once closed her curtains to Rosemary's cries now delivered 3 trays of lemon lavender muffins each Friday to the women's shelter. The first time she arrived, a young woman at the door asked her name. "Florence," she said, lifting the covered trays. "I used to listen to silence. Now I cook." Eleanor Lane had never been one for rituals, but that changed too. Each morning, she wrote one line in a small, leather-bound notebook. A memory, a regret, a hope. She folded each page, placed it in a wooden box beside the rosemary bush, and whispered a name. Rosemary. Some mornings it was. "I remember the way your dress fluttered when you walked through the garden. I should have asked where you went that day. Other days, I couldn't see what was happening under my own roof. But I see now. I see you." Beckett poured himself into the foundation, not as a face for interviews or ribbon cuttings, but as a listener. He held weekly listening hours at the public library. No sign, no clipboard, just him, a pot of tea, and a chair. Sometimes no one came. Other times, a woman would sit down, eyes hollow, and whisper, "He said I made it up." Beckett never interrupted. He just nodded. "I believe you." Words that had taken Rosemary a lifetime to never hear. He made sure others did. One rainy afternoon, a man showed up at the foundation. His coat was damp, his eyes uncertain. A sheriff's badge peeked from his inner jacket. He handed Beckett a yellowed manila envelope. "My father used to be a social worker. Said he warned someone about a woman named Rosemary back in '99. Said something felt off. They pushed him out not long after." Inside the envelope were hand-copied notes, unsigned letters, and one memo, dated 6 months before Rosemary's disappearance. Lane says the girl's emotional, but she's scared, pregnant. Something's wrong. The sheriff cleared his throat. "I didn't believe him. Not then. But I do now. I figured you should have this." Beckett looked at the envelope, then at the man. "She's not just in the well anymore," he said. "She's in all of us. You brought her another breath." Later that week, a letter arrived in a soft, slanted script. "Dear Beckett, I was Rosemary's sister. I didn't know until last year. I was adopted. Always wondered why I hummed the same tune she used to. You brought her name back. I've spent years looking for it. It ended with, I'll visit when the daffodils bloom. I want to leave a flower, and maybe hum to her myself. When Harold Whitmore passed away that June, peacefully in his sleep, he left behind more than a will. He left a deed. The deed to his house, now gifted to the foundation, marked with one note. This house held silence for too long. Let it hold truth now. They renamed it Whitmore House, a refuge, a home. No keys were locked behind glass, no doors barred, just beds, books, and listening ears. One of the first residents, a woman with a missing tooth and 3 jobs, said on her first night, "This place smells like honesty." By Beckett's 40th birthday, things had changed. Not everything, but enough. He'd married a teacher named June, quiet and clear-eyed. Together, they adopted a little girl named Rose. She sang to herself while coloring, half hums, like someone finishing a melody someone else had started long ago. Rose was 8 when she asked, "Who am I named after?" Beckett knelt beside her, someone who was brave in silence and soft in places the world tried to harden. Someone we still sing to. Eleanor, now in her 90s, stayed long enough to see Rose run barefoot through the garden, fingers trailing rosemary stems, leaving laughter behind her like footprints. "She hums like her grandmother," Eleanor whispered one afternoon. "The blood remembers, even when the heart forgets." One November, Beckett visited the grave of his mother again. He brought no flowers, just a letter from Rose, written in purple marker. "Dear Rosemary, I think you would have liked pancakes and rain and messy braids. I hope I make you proud." He tucked the letter beside the rosemary plant. The wind picked up, just enough to hum. That winter, a bench was carved near the garden. No plaque, no title, just one line etched softly into the wood. For every story that almost stayed buried. And in church basements across the country, something else began. Whisper circles. Groups of women, some old, some just beginning, gathered to speak the names they'd kept locked in ribs and bone. Each circle opened the same way. "This is a room without shame. Speak what was never safe, and let the rosemary rise." It was a Sunday in late spring, one of those rare days where even the breeze feels like it knows how to hold you. The rosemary garden outside Whitmore House had begun to bloom in waves of soft green and violet, the stems nodding in agreement with the wind. Beckett stood near the edge of the path, a small hand-carved sign in his arms. He read the inscription once more before placing it into the soil. She was never lost. She was waiting. Behind him, the front door opened. June stepped out, holding Rose by the hand. The girl, now 11, wore a soft cotton dress dotted with tiny bluebells. Her hair was braided back loosely, a few strands escaping like thoughts that refused to be tamed. "Is this where she stood?" Rose asked quietly. Beckett nodded. "She used to come here before anyone else woke up. She'd talk to the wind." Rose tilted her head. "Do you think the wind answers back?" Beckett knelt, brushing his fingers through the rosemary. "Only if you whisper something worth remembering." Inside, a small group had gathered. Survivors, donors, and a few who simply needed a place to sit among stories that didn't judge them. Eleanor's journal had been placed in a glass case near the entryway. The last page, written in uneven handwriting before her passing, read, "We cannot rewrite the beginning, but we can choose to hold the ending with gentler hands." Later that afternoon, a woman approached the house alone. She wore a long denim coat, and her face bore the quiet architecture of someone who had endured more than she'd said aloud. She paused at the gate, then stepped through, one foot after another, as though reclaiming ground she hadn't dared walk in decades. Beckett recognized her. Her name was Clara. She had testified in court during Gregory Lane's trial, a distant cousin, once a summer guest in that old house. She had been just 16 when she saw Rosemary crying in the hallway. She had walked past. Now, she walked up to the rosemary bush. "I brought this," she said, handing Beckett a photo. "I didn't give it during the trial. I was scared, but I'm not now." The photo was of Rosemary at 17, laughing beside a faded hammock. The corners were torn, but her joy was intact. "I remember that laugh," Beckett whispered. "I remember not protecting it," Clara said. There was silence. The kind that doesn't ask for forgiveness, but offers space to be human again. "She would have forgiven you," Beckett said finally. "She already has." By dusk, the guests were gone. Only Beckett, June, and Rose remained in the yard. Fireflies began to emerge from the underbrush, blinking like stars, learning to trust their own light. Rose walked to the center of the garden and opened a folded letter. Her voice, though young, carried something older, something that had been passed down, not through genetics, but through grief and grace. "Dear Rosemary, I think about you when I read stories about women who weren't believed. I think about you when I wake up safe and warm and wonder who never had that chance. I think about you when I hear the wind, and I try to hum." Beckett listened. He didn't cry, not this time. Instead, he closed his eyes and listened, and for a moment, it felt like the wind really did answer back. The next morning, a package arrived at Whitmore House. No return address. Just a note inside. "She was my cellmate once. She used to talk in her sleep. She whispered the name Rosemary again and again. I don't know what happened to her, but I think she was remembering something good before she forgot herself. Thought you should know." Enclosed was a handmade bracelet, threadbare, beaded, faded from time. The final bead was shaped like a leaf. Beckett held it in his hand. Not everything in the world can be explained, but some things simply ask to be honored. Years passed, and Whitmore House expanded. One room became a workshop for teen mothers. Another became a recording studio where survivors could speak their stories, not for public consumption, but for their own healing. The walls held their voices, like a cathedral holds echoes. Beckett never spoke about Gregory again, not in bitterness, not in triumph. The trial was part of the story, but not the whole of it. What mattered more was what came after. The garden, the circle of names, the little girl who grew up humming lullabies that had no known beginning. On the 15th anniversary of the well's discovery, the town held a vigil. People came with candles and rosemary clippings. A local choir sang softly. Children carried drawings of birds, because Rosemary had once said she wanted to be one. Beckett stood beside the stone circle. "Her story is not a warning," he said to the gathered crowd. "It's a bridge, a light in the wind. A reminder that even those who are buried by time can still rise in the way we remember them." That night, Rose sat at the foot of her bed. She opened a journal of her own and began to write. "When I grow up, I want to be someone who listens. I want to make spaces where people don't have to be brave to speak. I want to build something that smells like rosemary and truth." She paused, then added, "And I want to remember the woman who gave me her name, not because she had to, but because someone finally whispered loud enough for the wind to carry it back." She closed the journal, looked out the window, and saw the rosemary swaying. It didn't matter that she'd never touched Rosemary's hands. She felt them, in the hum of the wind, in the warmth of the home, in the ache that became beauty. The story ends not in silence, but in song, a soft, wordless melody carried by those who remember. A garden, a name, a girl, and the truth, rising like light in the wind. Sometimes what we bury is not just a person, it's the truth, the pain, the memory we were too afraid to hold. But when that truth is finally brought into the light, it doesn't just heal one life, it softens an entire town. It gives strangers the courage to speak, the forgotten, the dignity to be remembered, and the living a reason to live more gently. Rosemary's story reminds us that silence isn't always peace, and that remembering someone, truly remembering them, is a form of justice that echoes far beyond the courtroom. We don't all have a garden of rosemary outside our door, but we do have stories. We have names. We have each other. And maybe, just maybe, that's enough to begin again. Have you ever carried a truth in silence for too long? What's one small way you can honor your own story, or someone else's, today? And how are you doing lately? Is your heart feeling heard? Your spirit feeling rested? I'd love to know. Share with me below.